World Cup is essentially a war on the pitch. But in the past, not all nations were invited for various reasons, ranging from single players to outright war. How ironic, but whatever grudge any nation harbored against another country, they could surely take it outside. Moreover, taunting the loser is allowed if and when the best team must have won the battle. But honestly, where's your sportsmanship, guys? Welcome. It looks like you made it. In today's video, we'll be naming the countries that were canceled from the World Cup the last time we checked. We'll start with some World War beef. FIFA in the World Cup tournament has been around for a long time. It's almost getting to a century since the World Cup was first organized. But during that period, not everything has been smooth sailing. There's been interruptions in the calendar of the World Cup, and we are not just referring to the Qatari World Cup being played in the winter months of 2022. In truth, there have been two major world wars. The first started in 1914, and the second occurred between 1939 and 1945. To put it into perspective, the first ever World Cup was held in 1930. With 13 teams in total. It mostly avoided the First World War, but two World Cup meetings were skipped when the Second War broke out. Now, enough of the history lesson. After World War II, FIFA thought it was necessary to ban teams from the aggressor countries of the war, namely Germany and Japan, so the World Cup resumed in the year of 1950, 5 years after the end of the war. But surprisingly, Italy was allowed to join the Mondial. If memory serves us right, Mussolini, the Italian dictator, was friends with Hitler, and yet they were allowed to participate. Isn't that a double standard from the guys at FIFA? Let's kick it out. If you didn't know, this slogan represents the campaign by FIFA to kick racism and prejudice out of football. Now, most people might not remember a time when whites and blacks were not allowed to mingle. It happened in America and especially in South Africa as well. Talking about double standards as well, America was not banned from FIFA because of racism, but South Africa was. The South African brand of racism was called apartheid. So much so that South Africa sent two different teams to consecutive World Cups. One group was all white and the other was all black. That's how deep it was. So FIFA decided to ban South Africa from its tournaments from 1961 to 1992. But let's look at that team selection more closely. The ruling government of South Africa wanted to prove a point, sending an all-white team to England '66 and then following that up by sending an all-black team to Mexico '70 was part of a bid to mock the world, and perhaps the blacks as well. They were more or less taunting the Committee of Nations, and so FIFA said, take that. But democratic rules didn't return to South Africa until 1994, which is when the ban was lifted. South Africa even hosted the World Cup in 2010. Suffice it to say, they've come a long way, so good for them. Are you of drinking age? Mexico has hosted the World Cup twice, once in 1970 and also in 1986. They are also joint hosts with the US and Canada from the 2026 tournament. However, after the 1986 World Cup, they were desperate to make the cut, and so fielded overage players for the 1988 Olympic qualifiers. Apparently, this is a serious offense on the part of any National Football Association. What's the big deal, you might ask? Everyone falsifies their actual age once in a while. That way, they can get away with doing stuff reserved for specific age groups. It's either that or they're in denial. But if you think about it, what advantage would a team of slightly older players have? Perhaps the fact that on average you're 2 or 3 years older than your opponent might mean that you have a better setup. The argument doesn't make that much sense though. The Mexicans were banned from all FIFA-related competitions for 2 years, but made it just in time to participate in Italia 1990. Here's the cheat sheet. This incident plays out like a soccer movie. So, Chilean goalkeeper Roberto Rojas thought long and hard about his team's chances of qualifying for the next World Cup in Italy in 1990. The only team standing between them and qualification was Brazil. According to the predictions, a draw wouldn't have worked. An outright win against almighty Brazil was unlikely. So what did Rojas do? He hid a razor in his gloves in anticipation of a mishap. He was hoping the Brazilian fans would throw a projectile at him so that he could claim that he had been hit. It was clever, and you'd have to agree his foresight was deep. The only loophole was that a cameraman close by recorded the actual event, and as expected, a Brazilian fan threw a projectile and Rojas slumped to the grass, bleeding. He was then stretchered off, and the Chileans abandoned the match. On a review of the footage from the incident, though, FIFA discovered that he hadn't been struck by the projectile at all, and had used a hidden razor to cut himself. There was also an indication that Rojas had been working alone. The Chileans were suspended and Rojas was banned for life along with the team doctor and the coach. Crazy stuff. We don't care anyway. FIFA has had it up to its neck with the Burmese national team, so FIFA has sent them to the detention room. Myanmar, or Burma, is like the odd truant student who constantly refuses to participate in class activities even when given the opportunity. They habitually miss qualifier dates, and it's not like they stand a chance of progressing anyway. They have probably figured that aspect out, and so don't care anymore. On their part, FIFA has taken a stance to ban them. But did we mention that they don't care? If you were FIFA, what other action might you take? There goes another war. Much more recently, Russia invaded the Ukraine, and the West slapped all sorts of sanctions on the Russians. FIFA didn't want to be the odd one out, and so included theirs as well. Russia is officially banned from all sporting-related activities. Apart from football, this ban also includes athletic meets and so on. Wealthy Russians are not even allowed to do business in foreign countries. Case in point, Abramovich, the former owner of Chelsea, was forced to sell off his financial stake in the club. Consequently, the Qatar 22 football qualifying campaign for Russia was discontinued. Even Russian clubs playing in European competitions like the Champions League were banned. The Russian national team was 2 games away from qualifying for their 3rd consecutive World Cup in Qatar, but sadly, they were tossed to the curb. Mind you, just 4 years ago or thereabouts, they were determined hosts, but see how much things have changed since that time? Under false pretenses. This is about the case of one Byron Castillo, on whether he is Colombian or Ecuadorian, but unfortunately on the other side of the dispute are his haters, namely the Chilean national team. They are the ones who have taken the case up to the International Court for Arbitration in sports. The allegations are that Byron was originally born in Colombia and then moved to Ecuador more recently, and that his citizenship papers have been falsified in such a way as to make him ineligible to play for Ecuador. There's something fishy here, or so the Chileans thought. Either that or Byron is the Ecuadorian equivalent of Messi, and the Chileans are afraid he will steal the show. A newspaper as reputable as the Daily Post in England has even dispatched an investigative journalist to shed more light on the case. It was discovered that Castillo's Ecuadorian papers say he was born in 1998, whereas there's another set of documents suggesting he was born in Colombia instead in 1995. To top it all off, a recording obtained by the journalist had Byron admitting that he entered Ecuador illegally. As it turns out, the Ecuadorian football officials did this recording, so your guess is as good as ours. They knew all along. Chile, on their part, have found the perfect excuse to qualify for the World Cup. Nevertheless, what did FIFA eventually decide? Drum roll, please. By now, you'd figure that Ecuador wasn't banned from playing at the Qatar 2022 World Cup. Instead, the judges at the Court for the Sports Arbitration agreed that false documents were used to naturalize Castillo as an Ecuadorian citizen. But according to FIFA rules, he was eligible to play. However, the Ecuadorian Football Association has been fined 100,000 Swiss francs, and 3 points have been deducted from their yet future 2026 World Cup qualifying campaign. So sorry to the guys from Chile. If it's any consolation, the 2022 World Cup is done and dusted, and your rivals, Ecuador, didn't do that well. So in the lead up to the 2026 World Cup, all other teams had better learn a lesson from the canceled teams on this list. To participate in the World Cup, you cannot afford to be naughty. Nonetheless, some teams won't legitimately qualify to play. This doesn't suggest they were banned. Instead, you could say they banned themselves for playing so poorly. And finally, in our YouTube football game, there are only 3 rules. Subscribe, like, and tackle that notification bell. So see you in the next video.